a cháirde agus fáilte chu córá leis an Comhrá, lumsa Cuan Ó Seireadáin Comhrádaí Chonradh na Gaeilge. I mahananta inniu tá talamh Tim McMahon ó Ollscoil Marquette in Milwaukee, Wisconsin Stáit Aontaithe Mheiriceá. Agus ba muidir caint inniu mBéarla mar gheall ar an leabhar scríomh Tim, beag nach fiche bliain ó hine anois, grand opportunity, star Chonradh na Gaeilge sna luamh blianta, an tain leabhar mBéarla réasúnta mór faoi star Chonradh na Gaeilge. Tim, chuna sa tá tú?
Ja me go donna, chuna tá tú?
Tá me go réasúnta donna. Today we will do the chat in English because Tim is more comfortable speaking in English. Although I know that his understanding of Irish is excellent because the sources that he was working with for Grand Opportunity were almost exclusively in Irish, certainly the primary sources. May I ask, Tim, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, it originated with my doctoral research. I'd originally, when I started graduate education, I was really interested actually in my family region in County Monaghan, which retained Irish until fairly late in the 19th century. And I was actually looking at hoping to look at the fading away of Irish in that region. But my doctoral supervisor, based here in the United States, said, we'll have a hard time getting the sources. You need to learn Irish if you're going to do this, and so forth. So I began by trying to learn some Irish, and he suggested actually tilting the discussion a little bit more to saying, we need to know more about the Gaelic League. We need to know more about the ways in which the Irish revival, the Gaelic revival specifically, really affected early 20th century Ireland. And, he knew that I also had a great interest in popular culture. So the idea of, studying the odd feis and so forth was something that really mattered to me. And that was really the germ of the idea, was to try and sort who actually participated in the revival, why they did, how they engaged with the language.
And how did you go about structuring or planning your research? Because there aren't a huge amount of texts available in English on the history of Chonradh na Gaeilge, and most of the texts in Irish about the history of Chonradh na Gaeilge were written by members or people associated with Chonradh na Gaeilge. So it's not easy to find a critical, objective, outside view of the organization.
Right. So, really, what I benefited from a couple of different things. I was a postgraduate student at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, which has a very long, proud tradition of studying Irish and British history. And so there was an extensive library there that also had great facilities for what we call interlibrary loan, right? So that I could get materials that were at other libraries. So that was step one, was access to materials that way. Step two was learning the Irish language. So I was really very lucky that one of the librarians in Madison had learned Irish from some Achill Islanders. And she spent a great deal of time helping me to learn Irish. And then a third thing was that I had the opportunity to come and spend significant time in Ireland. So in 1995 and 1996, I spent 8.5 months in the archives, National Archives, National Library, Trinity College, Mount Melleray Abbey, Conradh na Gaeilge, just a host of places, sorting through as much material as I could. And then it took me several years because, my Irish is fair enough, especially the reading knowledge, but it takes me a little longer. So I spent time just diving into those sources and breaking it apart with the really two big questions in mind. Who were these revivalists, and why did they do what they did? And so, ultimately, I was trying to get through as much as I could about why people were engaged in the revival, and taking it a bit out of the question of the revival as precursor to the revolution, because so much of the literature, certainly in the English language, about the Gaelic League, built on this idea that it was a a school for revolutionaries. And that's built on essentially the biographies of a few dozen people who were obviously revolutionaries in whether 1916 or thereafter. But there were literally hundreds of thousands of people, as you well know, who were members of the Comhrá. So I wanted to know them as well as the revolutionaries. And ultimately, I think what at least as I read it came through was that their lives and their ideas about what it meant to be Irish were fundamentally transformed, even by limited exposure to the language and to the organization. And that did serve as a bit of a precursor to revolutionary ideas, but it wasn't like the motive force, right, behind the revolution.
So who participated in Chonradh?
Well, it varied on depending on where you were. So there's no question that the vast numbers of people who joined came from urban or town backgrounds, but there was a great outreach into the Gaeltachta and into rural Ireland as well. What I was able to do through both looking at membership lists and comparing those to local directories, to the census in 1901 and 1911, and then also looking at police reports and newspaper accounts, was to trace where the members lived as best I could, and then what their religious background was, what their occupational background was, and they were considerably more diverse, I think, than most of the prior scholars had given them credit for being. I would say that the bulk of Gaelic Leaguers were what sociologists might call lower middle class. They were people who had some education, some access to decent jobs. Many of them, though, came from families that had been skilled working class. Their parents, for example, would have been skilled workers. Some of them, like in Dublin, if you look at the Dublin branches of the Gaelic League, many of them were people who had moved to Dublin for work. So they came to Dublin from counties where they probably had some Irish, or at least they had heard it spoken around them. And then when they came to Dublin, they coalesced in branches where there were people probably from their same neighborhoods back home. And that this helped to fuel interest in the language also. But you look at the makeup, and you've got a small but sizable percentage of Irish Protestants. You've got Irish Unionists as well as Irish nationalists, and the bulk were certainly Irish nationalists. But the vast majority would have been, from a political standpoint, home rulers of the early 1900s. Though certainly you did have Republican-minded folks who were also involved. I was struck, though, too, that when you go into the countryside, one of the tensions that was really evident was that the Gaelic League really made a significant effort with staffing to appeal to people in the Gaeltachta. But because branches were often established in a town or a village, maybe the local market town, where English was the primary language, that Irish speakers from the outer regions, if you will, were less comfortable interacting with those folks, in part because they had, uneasy relationships, maybe lending relationships and so forth with them already. So there was a lot going on, and I was really encouraged to see just how diverse of people were involved.
If we trace early years of Gaeilge, foundation and so on, what are the main points along that journey? What are the main reasons the organization was founded, and what marks the early development of Gaeilge? That's a big question, I know, but
yeah, it's a very big question.
It's good to get a summary of that, I think.
Sure. In many ways, I think the answer is it depends on who you're talking about. Because, one of the things that I was really struck with too was that, the people who conceived of the idea of the Gaelic League and those who joined didn't always come at questions from the same perspective. And I think that's really an important thing to keep in mind. Very often, One looks at like talks like Douglas Hyde's necessity for de-anglicizing the Irish nation, or Owen MacNeill's call to the clergy, right? A plea and a plan, which both of which I think are foundational documents for the Gaelic League, right? Both of which are essentially saying there is value in the Irish language, and in the case of MacNeill appealing to the clergy, the clergy had such an important role in managing schools and also setting social tones in towns and villages across the island that they were a natural ally potentially for activists in this process. But what's interesting is that there was an overabundance, if you will, in the very earliest days, let's say 1894, 95, of middle class and very respectable middle class folks in the league. But part of that was just literally by the way that branches were put together in those early years. MacNeill, for example, was using the mailing list for Iaroswell na Gaeilge as a potential recruiting tool. So people who were already subscribing to the Gaelic Union's journal, most of whom would have been middle class. Maybe they'd picked up some Irish through even university education, or certainly through an intermediate school that might have had some Irish. And so they were almost antiquarian in their interests. But consciously, the leadership also, as I say, they really wanted to preserve Irish as a spoken language, and they knew that they needed to get away from, white collar workers or black coated workers in the cities and towns in order to do that. And so they made the conscious decision, I think, at the executive committee level, whether we're talking about Hyde and MacNeill or people like Father Michael O'Hickey, who succeeded Father Owen O'Growney as the professor of Irish at Maynooth. They made this conscious choice that they would welcome anyone with an interest in preserving the Irish language. So you start to see, branches of the Gaelic League being founded in, cyclist clubs, within unions. The Painters Union in Dublin, for example, on Ainger Street had a branch. Temperance groups became associated with the revival, as well as people who drank considerable amounts as well. So, this helps to broaden the interest in the language without necessarily saying everybody's coming at it for the same reason. And then again, you go out into the countryside, and I'm sure we'll talk more about the traveling teachers and the organizers. These were people who were hired by the organization beginning in 1898 to go into the countryside and appeal to Irish speakers in their homes and in their communities to try and keep the language alive.
But in the urban phase, the very first few years,
yeah,
the organization is very much concentrated in the towns and in small groups of people, primarily middle class, as you say. Is the evolution towards a broader national organization with a greater presence in the countryside, is that a natural organic process, or is there an element of a strategic decision to do that there? Is there an element of strategy to the whole concept of language revival? Because they are operating in a space where there are very few templates they can take from other places.
Right, yeah.
Similar stories that they can imitate. So what are the main influences on their thinking there?
Well, I think among their influences, and this is where again we get into the question of what's the political implication of this. Hyde very clearly says from the beginning in Necessity that you need to build on the example of James Stephens, literally walking the countryside to look for people who might be sympathetic to you. So the example of the Fenians in the 1860s, 1850s, 1860s, and the early organization of the Fenians is definitely something that they have in their head. But they're also very cognizant of the fact that Because people like Hyde and McNeill were learners themselves, they knew where they had to go to get the language, and they knew that if the language was going to be preserved as a spoken tongue, which was, after all, the first order of business of the Gaelic League, that they had to appeal to people who were native speakers. So there was the conscious decision. To do that, though, that takes money. So, I mean, if you're beginning with sort of a base of people much like yourselves in the middle class, then you recognize that you need to go beyond that, and those folks can help to fund it. So fundraising is a big part of the operation as well, both within Ireland and overseas with the Irish diaspora, because that's the kind of thing that facilitated their engagement beyond the cities and towns of Ireland.
The main activities they were involved in the cities were the provision of classes in the Irish language, or Irish language classes, but they also organized a lot of social activities. And these weren't, some of these were purely for pastime, but there was also an element of importing a certain set of ideas and values and concepts of what Ireland and Irishness were with those events. Could we talk a little bit about that and where that came from and where that led?
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of things in play here. So it's putting my historian's hat on. Historians of the 19th century especially like to talk about associational culture and how people gathered together, especially if they were themselves migrants. And so a place like Dublin or even Belfast would be great instances of cities that had lots of people who had moved into them for one reason or another. And so you join organizations, but this is happening all over Western Europe. It's happening in the United States as well. And one of the things that especially those in the middle classes are trying to do is to establish what they do as important and respectable. So there is a definite overlap, and particularly in a United Kingdom context, of the concept of respectability. I think it might come as no surprise to your viewers that the Irish were looked down upon by the British. They were seen as racially inferior. They were seen as culturally backward. And so part of the expression of the Gaelic League was to say there is actually value in who we are and what our culture is. Now, some of that involves taking on Victorian respectable mores and putting an Irish gloss on it, right? Especially because so many of the people who were engaged early on were learners. So they had come out of that Anglo environment or that Anglicized environment, and they're trying to Irishize it. They're Gaelicizing it. And so this is actually yet another one of these conflicts that happens when you set up a branch in a town or a village on the edge of the Gaeltacht, and you have people whose culture is in fact the indigenous culture coming in, and they say, well, that's actually not the way we do this. That's not the way we dance. That's not the way we sing. Even in the urban environment, though, one of the things that, like somebody like a McNeill would say to him was one of the great joys was when he would see somebody who was a little older, who clearly had grown up with Irish as their native language, coming into a meeting, and like he talks about people being almost tearful, seeing an urban English-speaking Irishman using the Irish language, going up to a blackboard, writing on the slate in Irish, and like possibly for the first time in their lives, these older people were seeing value in what they had known. And so I do think there is also this meeting of old and new that's worth thinking through also.
To what extent were they successful in integrating native speakers into the organization, into the work of the organization, and serving their interests? As you say, it was the primary goal of Conradh na Gaeilge was at that time was to ensure that the Irish language would remain in use in Ireland, and there was a huge focus on the idea that the areas they began to call Gaeltachta areas at that time would at least be preserved, if not expanded. So, to what extent was that strategy, was that idea successful?
That's the multi-million euro question now, isn't it? I mean,
and I don't have.
I think the answer is they were incomplete in their success. I believe what the League succeeded in doing in the first couple of decades of the 20th century was to ensure that Irish had a place in modern Ireland. Now, what that place would be is the complex element here. To be sure, I think they were much more successful in drawing in the learners of the language, those who developed the cúpla focal, as opposed to preserving Irish in its native regions. But at the same time, it's worth asking the question: why were native speakers themselves discouraging the use of the language? I mean, that's actually one of the things that I found, in my research, looking, for instance, at the traveling organizers' interactions with people in the Gaeltacht, that there were parents, for example, who, when asked why they wouldn't have their children learn Irish in school, they say, well, they need English to succeed. And some of these parts, especially in the West, were among the poorest regions on the island, of course. And so those families were dependent on their children emigrating and sending money back to survive. So for them, English was not merely a sign of respectability. It literally was, do we eat? Do we pay the rent? And so you definitely see some native speakers resisting the call to preserve the language, or at least to do it in the fashion that Gaelic Leaguers were advocating, right? Through schooling, through public activity, through festival and theater and so on. It's a really complex thing. Now, flip that around again. What they do succeed in doing is getting the message out that Irish was worth having, that Irish had value, and in fact, in some very pragmatic ways, the Gaelic League tried to counter that negative response in the Gaeltacht. So they encouraged cooperative stores. They encouraged cooperative farming. They encouraged the foundation of businesses that would hire Irish speakers. And so there were practical steps that were taken, but they were undercapitalized and didn't always last for very long. But I think that one of the misimpressions about the Gaelic revival too is that everybody was sort of these pie in the sky romantics about what the peasants were like. A lot of the Gaelic Leaguers who were involved, including native speakers who took on work for the League, right, who actively tried to promote the program, they knew of conditions in the Gaeltacht, and they wanted to make sure that there was a living for people in those regions, and if not in those regions, then that they could live and use the language in primarily English-speaking parts of Ireland.
And of course, the main industries that was encouraged by revival activity was language tourism. People in to travel to spend time in those areas that had both positive and negative effects, but it certainly had a positive economic effect. And there was a very interesting intercultural mix going on there. If we look forward as well, then a few years, over the first 10, 20, 30 years of Conradh na Gaeilge, there's quite a big development at the beginning, right up to that period in 1905, 1906, when the organization is really very large indeed, coinciding with Hyde's travels to the US to raise money to feed this organization, to keep this organization going. In the 10 years afterwards, a younger generation seemed to come through and push into the leadership a bit more. What changes did that second generation of leaders or activists bring to the organization, and what were their main influences?
Well, so you keep giving me these small questions, Cuan. There were many differences. I think in some ways the second, or if you will, the period between 1905 and 1915. You can't take the Gaelic League out of the context of Ireland at that time. So put in a broader term perspective, you're talking about a period when at the end of 1905 in the United Kingdom, a long period of Tory governance comes to an end, and the Liberals come back into power, and they are at least nominally wed to the idea of home rule. Now, home rule had been a losing proposition in British politics for the better part of a decade for Liberals. So the first couple of years under Liberal control, home rule was kind of on the back burner. But by 1910, it becomes a hot issue again, in part because the balance of power in the British Parliament is such that the Home Rule Party under John Redmond had a greater say in whether or not legislation got passed. So there are political interests in Ireland which do, I think, divert the attention of a younger generation away from the social and cultural activities of the Gaelic revival. At the same time, for some, they were intimately interlinked. Right. So like you see, for example, in FESH programs that, like essay competitions might talk about the value of the ranch war and the breaking up of large ranches so that smaller farmers have opportunities. And there's people are supposed to write about this in Irish. You see the emergence of even more dynamic, what are sometimes referred to as advanced political nationalists, those associated with Sinn Féin, and even more further out on the political spectrum, the IRB, and entryism, that is, joining organizations in order to try and control them, was something that had been a part of the Gaelic League since the very beginning. But you start to see that having more effect, particularly once we get past that 1910 mark. Many of the people who were, if you will, that sort of entryist sort were completely committed to reviving the Irish language and to create an Irish Republic, right? So I think about somebody like a Thomas Ashe, who was one of the most dynamic League leaders living at that point just north of Dublin. But like the Gaelic League sends him to America in 1913 and 1914 to raise money on behalf of the Irish language movement, and secretly he's raising money on behalf of the IRB as well. So you've got these sort of parallel things going on. But ultimately, in those years, the leadership, which includes these younger people like an Ashe, or I'm going to take Patrick Pearse out of that, because while he was engaged as a revivalist, and up until really he founds his own school, he's also editor of An Claidheamh Sáillis, but he basically leaves the day-to-day operation after he's founded St. Enda's. So, Pearse is somebody who still plays a role, but he's not really the policy setter that he had been before 1910. But people of that generation, the Bulmer Hobsons, the Thomas Ashes, Sean McDermott, Sean T. O'Kelly, these are people who are trying to steer the language movement to be much more openly in favor of an independent Irish state on the one hand, but they also are steering policy to be much more about requirements in schools, as opposed to sort of the voluntarist, let's all learn the Irish language that was much more common, say, in the first 8 or 10 years of the revival.
I think that there are two elements that are quite common at that time that bear thinking about. One is the great question about politics, the nature of politics, what that is, because there's often this discussion about the of Conradh Gaeilge's political or non-political nature. And I think, first of all, we have to define what we mean by political in that context.
Yeah.
It has a particular meaning at that time, and it has a different meaning later on. And I think the other thing that is, I think, important or worth noting is that the goals of achieving certain things within the governance of Ireland, the requirements for entry to universities and so on, they're concrete, achievable goals. And once you've achieved that, once you've won that campaign, you can say, we got that. We now the Postal Service is accepting addresses in Irish and so on. They're wins that are measurable. The general questions of revival, maybe they're measured by the census returns every 10 years, but the census returns at that time are a very rough measurement. And in fact, the 1911 census returns are quite a disappointment for a lot of revivalists. They don't see the gains that they're hoping to see. They do see gains in Leinster, actually, but in traditionally Irish-speaking areas, they don't see gains. So I think there may be a couple of things that work there that would be worthy of further research in the future.
Yeah, well, and I mean, you're absolutely right. I touch on that a little bit in Grand Opportunity. Just in many ways, sort of the sense of desperation that the 1911 census does set off. As you all know, in the Clive, they're publishing county by county statistics. And as they do, they there is this sort of sense. It's like, oh my gosh, we've put so much effort into this area or that area, and we're not seeing the gains. And there, I mean, I do think one of the, and I'm speculating on this, but I think one of the things we have to consider is, if the bulk of, for one thing, whether or not you speak Irish or are considered bilingual is something that you are telling to a member of the constabulary. So, is there a disincentive to actually acknowledging that you have Irish? What's the standard you're applying to yourself, or that the police officer is applying to you? I mean, would I be listed as somebody who's bilingual because I've got fair Irish that I can read, but I'm not speaking it very often, right? So, am I considered bilingual or not? And I mean, there is some provision that you can read and speak, or that you are only a reader or only a speaker. But most people aren't making those subtle distinctions as they're reporting out. So there's that. The other thing to think about is that so much of the effort was placed into schools, and we have to account for the fact that people are emigrating. So like even if a younger generation were in fact getting Irish, are they leaving as soon as they finish with school? And if so, we're not catching them between 1901 and 1911. And so that, and the reality is that more people were emigrating from the counties with Irish than from those which were primarily English speaking. So all of that, I think, does bear further investigation. It is interesting to me that urban areas, all right, I mean, and this is the flip side of that self-reporting, right? I want to say I have Irish. So, Leinster, Belfast actually shows growth between 1901 and 1911 as well, right? So, like, is this people claiming greater familiarity with the language than they may have? Probably.
At the very least, you can say that it indicates a positive attitude towards the Irish language. But whether you include much more than that from it, you have to take it with a note of caution. But it illustrates a certain type of success, but definitely not happy with what they see as a lack of progress in traditionally Irish-speaking areas. But perhaps the realistic expectation would have been to slow or halt the decline rather than to turn it around into growth. And sometimes I think there's an element too of, in maybe roughly the first 10 years of Conradh na Gaeilge, there's an element of analysis, and it's a less professional organization in many ways, but it is in some ways its goals are much more modest. And there's a kind of euphoria in the very early years, in the early 20th century, once the traveling teachers start working, and once the organization actually Gaelicizes itself, it starts to operate through Irish, and it thinks that it, as an organization, if it can do it to itself, it can do that in the country as well.
Right.
And the expectations are raised a lot in the second 10 years.
Yeah.
And of course, things turn out as they turn out.
The other thing I think to keep in mind, and this holds true, I think, with just about any type of political achievement. So to go back to your point about how one defines politics, let's call the campaign to make Irish a compulsory subject in the National University a political campaign, in part because they're pressurizing the new Senate of the National University to adopt a policy, but they're doing that by campaigning at the county council level to essentially say they will not grant scholarships unless, right? So this is a big part of the campaign operation. But part of the expectation is that if that is going to be the goal to get into the National University, that will infuse schools below that to adopt Irish much more handily. And those schools don't do it. You know, I mean, like you go back to the earlier efforts to create the so-called bilingual program in the schools, so that in Irish-speaking districts, students in the national schools would be taught through the medium of Irish, and that elsewhere they could take the courses voluntarily outside of school hours. Just because that policy becomes policy, that doesn't mean that the schools adopt and put it into practice. And I mean, this was a constant back and forth, I think, that the revivalists dealt with, because they campaigned for certain things and they thought they were achieving them. But once things came out in practice, it didn't work as well as they had hoped, basically because foot dragging by people who were not as motivated to follow the revival.
Well, that doesn't sound familiar at all in a modern context. But it is interesting that they're successful from the campaigning point of view in achieving the technical aim that they have. They get what they want, but the positive want doesn't have the positive effect that they hope it will have.
Well, and I mean, this is to your point also, and I think it's one of the things that I really try to bring out in the book, and that is that how we define success really does depend on the way that people live their lives. And there's no doubt in my mind that the fundamental achievement that was made, and that I do believe is measurable by that compulsory Irish campaign for the National University, was that there was an island-wide desire for Irish to have that place in the brand new national university. The name is important, the National University of Ireland, right? And that is a sign that the propagandist work that they've been doing, as well as the practical work they've been doing, has secured for Irish a place in the popular imagination. Now, where it goes from there is up to the people in their daily lives, right? And so that's the bit about 20th century Ireland as people are working out what it means to be Irish, Gaelicized. That's a tension, and it's clearly one that I mean, Ireland continues to deal with down to the present moment.
It continues to be. It's a live cultural discussion. The question of the Irish language, the place of the Irish language in modern Irish culture, is not a settled question by any means.
Right.
It's a question that invigorates a lot of people on. There are more than two sides in that debate as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a simple discourse at all. But I think too, often when people look back at that period, there are the people who celebrate it and they don't look at the less successful elements of it enough. And then there are people who see the whole thing as a massive disappointment and a huge letdown.
Right.
The utopian vision wasn't achieved, and the picture is much more complex. An independent state came into being in part of the island. That independent state tried to have or implemented an educational policy which had a huge focus on Irish, made it a key part of the curriculum. So Irish was mainly, the education system became the main mechanism for Irish language policy, such as it was. And then there was an element of policy looking at Gaeltachta areas and trying to assist them economically. And there are a lot of debates about the successes and failures of that. but the fact remains there was some element of a state focus on that, and there was a discussion. The importance of doing that was recognised to a greater or lesser extent by various governments. And
Right.
I think the key question is what would have happened if none of that had been in place? And I think we all know the answer to that question.
Right. Right. Yeah.
The patient is alive still,
Yes.
even if the
Well,
patient is
yeah,
not thriving and running in the Olympics just yet. The patient is
I
not dead. And
I get asked this by my American students quite a lot. You know, they'll say, you know, I mean, do people still speak Irish? Are there avenues for people to use Irish today? And you know, I'll send them to TG Comhrá. I'll send them to you know, various radio broadcasts, or I'll hand them books in the Irish language, and they'll say, well, that doesn't look. And I say, no, that's the Irish language, right? I mean, like, I can remember when I was first, you know, learning is and tá, and we were my wife and I were sitting to dinner with some of my extended family, and my grandmother, who was very proudly Irish American, said, "Well, can you say something in Irish?" And I did, and she said, "No one I ever knew used those words." And I said, "Yeah, but that's actually the Irish language, you know." I mean, and I think that you can go to parts of the island, as you well know, where nary a word of English is spoken, though it's understood clearly, but people use Irish, and I think that would not be the case, as you said, that would not be the case if the revival had not taken place.
And it is the very important job of historians to try to see things in their proper context, and to look at the data set or the facts that they find before them and to interpret them. And I think that would be a little bit of calmness about the whole discourse around the Irish language in respect of whether the revival has succeeded or failed would do us all a lot of good, because of course the utopian goal wasn't achieved, but at the same time the nightmare of the death of the Irish language also didn't occur. And there are lessons then to be learned from the things that succeeded.
Yeah,
I think.
I ask myself too, and I don't know. I mean, I say this as an outsider with great interest, but I ask myself too how we should define Gaeltacht today, right? I mean, is it a specific region? Is it a mentality? Is it a countrywide thing? Because I mean, I do think that there are parts of, if you will, Leinster where there's great interest in the Irish language, and you certainly have people attending, the Gael Squalana and so forth that, as a matter of choice, are keeping Irish alive within their own families and perhaps within the community of people they deal with. Are they less authentic in the 21st century than somebody who's living by the Atlantic? I mean,
I'm not going to venture an answer to that question, because again, that's one of those things that could get quite controversial. Because there
that's why I say, as an interested outsider, I'm asking that question. So
it's a good question. The only reason I hesitate to answer it, in any concentrated way, is because this is a discussion primarily about the history,
about the past.
But what I will say is that the idea of, there's a lot of ideology around the question of what a native speaker is, and the and the value of the quality of language spoken by certain groups of people, and there's sometimes a very negative view by native speakers who are located geographically in regions that were traditionally Irish speaking, about people who live outside those areas who may be the first generation to begin speaking Irish again. And there are discourses around that are very interesting and not necessarily very positive, but they're all part of that landscape of what's going on with the Irish language.
Right.
Today. And perhaps that's a discussion we'll have another time. But just to finish off today, I just ask you: are you doing any research in any way related to the Irish language at the moment?
I'm tangentially looking at it. I'm looking at partition right now, and the impact of partition. And so part of the discourse of the early 1920s, particularly from the Unionist side, is their negative impression of the Free State establishing Irish as a required subject. And so the tension around how the language was seen symbolically is a part of the study that I'm looking at. But I'm constantly going back and thinking and rethinking work on the revival, and the very real prospect of the archive that has wended its way to NUI Galway is very much in my head. So I am thinking that at the end of the partition project, I might be going back and revisiting Grand Opportunity and some of those earlier conclusions with new material. So I'm not done. Not done with this.
I can put you in touch with the right people in any case. Well, Tim, gur míle maith socht an tamach lacha leir slingin jo agus tá súil agam go maith caint a ríis go lua.